Welcome to the School Leadership Show, and thanks for downloading. This is Mike Dowdy, and if you've been listening and downloading for a while, you'll notice that I got rid of the intro. That's mostly because I listened to an episode the other day, or at least started to, and the intro was really annoying, so I'm not going to do that to people anymore. In any case, in this episode, Jen David Lang of The Main Idea and I talk about student engagement. Our conversation is based on the book Engagement by Design, Creating Learning Environments Where Students Thrive by Douglas Fisher, Nancy Fry, Russell Quaglia, Dominique Smith, and Lisa Land. And Jen has recently summarized this book in The Main Idea. So enjoy this conversation with Jen David Lang. Jen David Lang is back on the show. Hi, Jen.
Hey, Mike.
Great to talk to you again. Today we're taking a break from your new book with Kim Marshall, and because we always have to mention it. I think I'm just going to put it in every single show notes. And we're going to focus on a summary that you have done recently. Now, has it come out yet as of this recording?
Nope, November 15th.
Oh, very cool. So, and this is a summary of a book about student engagement. So tell us about that.
Sure. It's called Engagement by Design, Creating Learning Environments Where Students Thrive by Douglas Fisher, Nancy Fry, Russell Quaglia, Dominique Smith, and Lisa Land. And it's basically the main idea is that you can't learn if you're not engaged. So we as teachers need to create the kind of environment where students are engaged. And they have a framework, which they call Engagement by Design, that has 3 parts to it that we can explore today.
Yeah, let's start. Let's just get right into it. What are the 3 parts?
Okay, so first, I think it's wonderful that they've broken down student engagement into 3 parts, because how many times do you have an administrator goes into a classroom and says the students aren't engaged, right? Those words have probably come out of your lips, Mike. And, it's a common cry. We need our students to be more engaged. But what does that really mean? In many ways, it's jargon. So they help us define it, and that's always the first step to solving a problem, if you can define it. So they have this neat little graphic, which is one of the negatives of podcasts. You can't see it here, but they have a graphic with 3 overlapping circles. And the 3 parts of engagement are the teacher, the student, and the content, and where those 3 overlap. So the first place where they overlap is where the teacher and the student piece overlaps, and that's relationships. Yes, always the first thing that's necessary for engagement or just about anything else in a classroom. So they talk about the importance of building the teacher-student relationships, which I'm sure all of your listeners are very familiar with. And then they go further. They even break that down into 3 pieces, because that can be quite vague and amorphous. So they think about engagement as the teacher being 1, invitational, 2, equitable, and 3, an advocate. So what do those mean? When the teacher is invitational, he is welcoming. He creates a welcoming environment for students, and that means both psychologically and physically, a safe environment. 2, the second part of building teacher-students relationships is equity. You can't just make it so that some of your students are called on and some of your students feel welcome. So there's actually a nice list, and I have this at the end of the summary. It is the Teacher Expectations and Student Achievement Interaction Model. I don't know, some fancy word, TESA. But it's basically 15 daily actions that teachers can do to make sure that they're being equitable. It was designed in LA in the Office of Education to address equity issues in their schools. So things like making sure that you call on all students individually, equally, making sure that you ask the kind of questions that everybody can answer, giving praise, listening to all students, those kinds of, they're very simple 15 activities you can do, 15 behaviors in the classroom as the teacher to build relationships.
And
And
that's,
then the third,
I was going
yeah,
to
go
say,
ahead.
and that's
Yeah.
interesting too, because I'm looking at that list now of 15, and that list is broken down into three categories. So things related, like, and you mentioned some from each category, things related to response opportunities, like how, like you said, do you call on everybody? Feedback, and personal regard. So I thought that we could do a whole podcast on just that list. That's a really good list.
It's a great list, and it's not necessarily all the actions you think about when you think about equity, but it is literally equity. And all of us as teachers have the problem where we often favor some students over others, and that impacts the relationship. Going back to that first component of student engagement.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, anything more? I mean, obviously, relationships, we know, right? Can't learn from a teacher you don't like. You need to have that relationship piece. That's not news. That's nothing new, I don't think, to anyone listening.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I think while it's one of those things we often point to as a you either have it or you don't, or you're born with it kind of ability to build relationships. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that, looking at that list of 15 and thinking about some actions you can actually take in that realm, you can get better at it. And I think that's something that is important for people to know, that it isn't you have it or you don't.
Yes, I think that's one of the myths of teaching, that it's purely inborn, and it's not at all. It is something you can learn. And in fact, I think one of the misconceptions about student engagement is that as a teacher, what do we need to do to engage students? We need to stand on our heads. We need to get in front of the classroom and rap for students, and all of these sort of extroverted, crazy, over the top behaviors. Whereas in this book, they're saying, no, that's not what student engagement is about. Student engagement is about much deeper things. It's about teacher relationships to begin with. Or the second piece, which is teacher clarity. That is the overlap between the teacher circle and the content circle, is clarity. So clarity is not sexy at all, right? It's not standing on your head, but think about it in a really basic way. Students cannot engage with content they don't understand. There's nothing more basic than that. Students cannot engage with content they don't understand. So again, let's break down what is teacher clarity according to these authors. Some really basic stuff. Do you know, as the teacher, what students are supposed to learn? Do you literally know the content standards, and do you also know the knowledge that your students walk into a classroom with? Second piece, do you know how students learn? Do you know anything about child development? Do you know how students might be misunderstanding the material? Do you know the importance of errors when you're teaching? So that's the second part of teacher clarity. The third part, do you know how to communicate what students will be learning? Yes, can you communicate a learning goal? Not just write it on the board. Can you communicate it? But also, can you give good feedback? I don't know if everyone thinks of feedback as communication about what you want students to learn, but that's exactly what it is. And finally, have you communicated what mastery looks like for students? If they don't know what they're shooting for, they can't reach the goal. So have you created some type of rubric or checklist that gives students an idea of what good learning looks like?
And I think this is so cool that it's laid out in this way, and I think it's so important because this is one of those things around clarity that I think sometimes people give lip service to but really don't pay enough attention to it. This idea of teachers having a deep understanding and knowledge of their own standards is huge. How do you write a clear objective if you don't really know the content and the standards yourself?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that I think part of why this is so powerful is it isn't that the authors just pulled this out of their back pocket. They based these ideas on some strong research, primarily John Hattie's review of educational research. As your listeners probably know, he has synthesized thousands of research studies and came up with those influences that have a significant impact on student achievement. That is, those influences that have more than a 0.40 effect size. Anything that has a 0.40 effect size of an impact on student achievement means that it achieves 1 year of learning within 1 year. So something like relationships or clarity, these all are, these weren't just chosen out of thin air, but these were chosen because they have a high impact on student learning. So relationships have an impact of 0.72, an effect size of 0.72, and clarity has 0.75. So that means if you are successful as a teacher in being clear, your students can learn almost twice as much in 1 year what a teacher typically teaches twice as much in 1 year as one teacher teaches in 1 year. Was that clear?
That was super clear to me. But but I think that's important, and I love it when I don't know. I feel like this is really operationalizing that idea of, what Hattie said to a level that, or what Hattie found, to a level that is, usable, observable, and, that I think doable.
Absolutely. I think it's taking the research and translating it in the same way that, you and I are doing this podcast so that we can take what's in this book and translate it for school leaders into what they can be promoting and doing in their schools.
So can we just go a little bit deeper into the how students learn? Because now that we've had all of the learning style stuff debunked, basically, what do the authors point to as being the big components of what teachers need to know about how students learn?
Well, the first thing they do talk about is teacher noticing and the role of errors in learning. So teacher noticing is not just paying attention to what you're doing and your actions as a teacher up there, hopefully not in front of the class, on the side of the class, but noticing your students' responses. Where are they misunderstanding? What are the misconceptions in your field that your students have bought into? So if you're paying attention to yourself and you're not noticing your students, you're going to miss that. And then the second thing is understanding the role of errors. I think that through the work of Carol Dweck and others, we're understanding that errors don't mean, aha, student is wrong, move on. No, in fact, errors are a wonderful way, and they're a natural part of the way that we learn. It's only by having those misconceptions or misunderstandings that sometimes we need that to get to our understanding.
Definitely. All right, so where do we head next?
So the final aspect after relationships and clarity is where the students and the content overlap. And that third piece is challenge. As teachers, we need to have the appropriate level of challenge in order for students to be fully engaged. Now, I say appropriate because that doesn't mean that we assign 50 more math problems to do, or we give students 10 minutes to do something instead of 50 minutes. But it has to be an appropriate level of challenge. We have to give them a variety of tasks that are just above their level, like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So just a little bit harder than they could do on their own. And that's appropriate. And also a wide range, not just one type of task. And if you think about it, right, when you think about when you have your own engagement, when you're in flow in your life, it's not when you're doing something really easy that you've done a million times before, like brushing your teeth. It's usually something that involves some element of challenge. And you feel proud of yourself that you've overcome that challenge and you've gotten through it.
And it's interesting to look at how they lay that out, because, oftentimes we think of, you think of engagement, it's about, how do you help students connect with the curriculum in a way where they can either see themselves or they can connect it to something that they've already learned or part of their background, which I like how they broke it up into these four areas because it seems like that kind of transcends that connection piece and would only kind of strengthen it.
Yeah, the four pieces that you're talking about, they've divided challenge into four types of tasks that have to do with difficulty and complexity. And complexity is like the level of thinking, if you can imagine in Bloom's taxonomy, and difficulty is the amount of time or effort you put in. So they have sort of a complex like high difficulty, low complexity, high difficulty, all these different categories of tasks. But basically they call them strategic thinking tasks, fluency tasks, struggle tasks, and stamina tasks. And more than knowing exactly what all these are, I think the importance is that you have a wide range of challenge in different ways, of thinking, of working hard for a long time. But then also you help to encourage a growth mindset so that students also learn the importance of persevering and working hard over time. And that's one of the most difficult things that we have as teachers is to figure out what's the right kind of challenge and how do I provide a range of different types of challenges for a range of different types of students.
So and then they kind of get into they go back to the big picture of how it all sort of fits together around behavioral engagement, cognitive engagement, emotional engagement. What else to sort of kind of bring it all together before we talk about maybe, how a leader might integrate this into his or her practice? But any sort of other big ideas that emerge from this that are important to highlight?
Well, I like their distinction. We didn't really talk about the behavioral engagement, particularly versus cognitive engagement. They have sort of a nice case study, which I think has probably happened to all of us. So I'm just going to share the case study they include. They write, Brandon sits near the window and seems more concerned with what is happening outside than what his teacher is saying. While he appears behaviorally disengaged, a quick check-in reveals he's been following every word. Meanwhile, his classmate Heber sits up straight, tracks his teacher with his eyes, and holds his pencil poised to write down new information. He appears engaged, but a follow-up with him shows he cannot identify the lesson topic. So I think this is a big problem that we've all seen, that, the non-squeaky wheel, the kids who have their mouths closed and their eyes open and their pencils cocked and ready to, write every word, we assume, oh, those students are engaged. And it's the other student staring out the window, chatting with a neighbor who's not engaged. But if we start to break apart this idea of engagement into different aspects, you see that the second student, Heber, he was behaviorally engaged, but he wasn't cognitively engaged. He wasn't engaged with the academics. And if you want to throw in a third part, emotionally engaged, did he even care? Did he care about the material, his peers, his relationship with his teacher? So that's a big question. How do we distinguish between those students who are behaviorally engaged and those who are cognitively? And this is where the authors do also point to John Hattie, who talks a lot about making student thinking visible. We can't know if students are cognitively engaged unless we see their thinking. So how do you see thinking? We can't open up their heads and go into their brains, but what do? We have to design activities that allows them to reveal their thinking. So that means we can't be standing in the front of the classroom lecturing at students. We need hands-on activities where we as the teachers can listen to their conversations. They need products. They have to be writing. They have to be exploring all out on paper so that we can see their thinking. Because unless you know students' thinking, you don't really know if they're fully cognitively engaged.
And do they get any deeper into that in terms of how to plan for at the teacher level or how to supervise for at the administrator level those kinds of activities and to promote engagement?
So, they don't speak specifically about the visible learning. There are lots of other books about visible learning, but I put together some PD suggestions at the end for school leaders. And I really think that the first first place to start. You could certainly start with talking about the importance of student engagement, but everybody kind of knows that. But really talking about a definition. Imagine if you ran a school where you had a school-wide definition of student engagement. Because right now, if you, for your first activity in a PD session, ask every teacher to write down a definition, I bet you would have as many different definitions as you have teachers in the room.
Easily.
So yeah, I think to look at their definitions and share the author's definition, that it's this overlap of clarity, relationships, and challenge. When all these three are happening at once, that's when engagement occurs, and that's when optimal learning occurs. So you could together with your school come up with a definition that you want to follow. You could have a task force, you could do it school wide, but to really have them think about what does it mean? And that's helpful because then when a principal walks into a classroom, she knows what she's looking for. She's not going to make a comment to a teacher after like the students weren't engaged, because that is just too vague. So maybe she'll double down and think about, all right, well, let's think about clarity. The learning goal that you had on the board was very clear, but then it wasn't clear when you were giving feedback to students that the feedback had anything to do with that learning aim, so something more specific than just simply saying the students weren't engaged.
Right. That makes sense. And I think we've, as we went through our last round of reform, a lot of states, took a crack at implementing teacher practice rubrics where engagement, was always part of that. And then really trying to get to the point of identifying the behaviors that demonstrate engagement on the student's part, but then also on what the teacher does to facilitate that. So yeah, that makes sense. And I think I like that strategy for getting at the definition by having them think about it themselves first and then kind of look at the one from the book.
Absolutely. And I think you had asked what implications this has for planning. Certainly you could have teachers come to a session with a lesson plan, and people could work in teams to critique each other on how well students would be engaged in this classroom, or could they tighten up relationships, clarity, or challenge, and go more specifically into, for relationships, might they be able to use some of these 15 strategies that we mentioned that are in the summary? Or for clarity, which aspect of clarity is not clear in the lesson, which of the 4 aspects we talked about? Or for challenge, are they relying very heavily on one of the 4 types of challenge tasks and not a different type of challenge tasks? Are they not using different kinds to appeal to different learners? So you certainly could do an activity to help teachers improve their planning around student engagement.
And I definitely think that I want to spend time with that teacher expectations and student achievement interaction model, or TISA. Those 4 things. I think that would be fun to go after a little bit, because that seems pretty practical. Yeah,
very hands-on. So lots of activities that a leader could do with teachers with the ideas in this book.
Excellent. So any parting shots on this work? Are you willing to share a summary if folks email you?
Sure. They can send me an email and I'll send you a summary of this book when it's out. It's not out yet.
Oh, excellent. And anything else for the good of the order here?
I mean, I think there's a lot of different definitions of student engagement, and I think this one is centered around most schools as they're organized right now. You can also throw the whole thing up in the air, and you can certainly look at redesigning entire schools for student engagement, where the day is driven by what students want to learn. It's driven by internships and going out in the community. So they're definitely are broader definitions of student engagement, but this is student engagement for schools as they exist now, when you're bound by you still have your 4 walls and your classrooms, but there's definitely a larger way to think about student engagement that's exciting in the 21st century too.
Yeah, and I think it is practical. And like we kind of mentioned a couple times, there are some very specific concrete teacher behaviors that can be observed in the service of increasing student engagement. So that makes sense.
Good. Yeah.
All right. Well, Jen David Lang, thanks again for such a regularness of appearances on the show. I appreciate it. And I don't know, should we tease where we're going next?
I don't know. Let's keep them waiting.
All right. Sounds like a plan.
Thanks for chatting.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.